All right, Euro Bears. I can think of no better way to start the lecture on the Enlightenment era by beginning with a biography. Voltaire is considered to be one of the most important people of the entire century of the 18th century, if not the single most important individual. I was once reading a particular history book, and the author, who was the historian Will Durant, he had a nice way of stressing the importance of Voltaire by saying, Italy had a Renaissance, Germany had a Reformation, but France had Voltaire. It might be a bit of an exaggeration to say that Voltaire started the Enlightenment, but he certainly was a very important person in the Enlightenment. What's interesting is, in this era of new ideas and philosophies, Voltaire really doesn't present any new ideas or any new philosophies. So what makes him so important? Well, that's what we're going to learn about today. Okay, so let's place Voltaire in context. This is the 18th century, the era of Enlightenment. Now, a more specific way to identify the era of the Enlightenment is to bookend it with the years 1688 and 1789. So 1688, you should know, is important because this is the year of the Glorious Revolution. Glorious Revolution creates a constitutional monarchy up in England. We've got an English Bill of Rights, and the following year, 2 years later, John Locke writes his two treatises on government. So 1688, Glorious Revolution, begins the era of the Enlightenment, and then the era of Enlightenment ends in the year 1789 when there is a revolution in France. Okay, so what was the era of Enlightenment? So this is my definition for the era of Enlightenment. I try to keep this as short and simple as possible. I would define it as the era between 1688 and 1789, in which many Europeans, not all, but many Europeans, began questioning a tradition and authority in an effort to empower individuals and improve society. Now, I'll talk a lot about the Enlightenment in this particular definition throughout this lecture. For me, repetition will be important so that you guys really have a good understanding of this century and what happens to Western civilization during this century. So let me unpack it a little bit here. So it's the era between the Glorious Revolution and the French Revolution in which many Europeans, so many, not all, but many, and we'll talk about how there was a high Enlightenment and a low Enlightenment. And so different Europeans from different backgrounds are going to experience the Enlightenment in different ways. And it wasn't all Europeans. It tended to be focused more in the cities and more in the West. So great centers of the Enlightenment, very much Paris, France, and then also you had London, England, and Berlin in Prussia. These were great centers of the Enlightenment. But we'll learn about one particular French philosopher by the name of Denis Diderot. And Diderot said, the Enlightenment doesn't go past the suburbs. In other words, once you leave the city, and for Diderot, his city was Paris. Once you left Paris, then people there continued not to be enlightened individuals. Ignorance was dominant in the countryside. That's what Diderot saw. All right, so this was also a time when people are questioning tradition and authority. So the way we've always done things in the past, tradition, that falls under scrutiny. Institutions of power, like aristocrats, monarchies, the church, these also fall under scrutiny. A lot of the philosophers and other individuals of the Enlightenment really want to empower individuals, and by questioning these traditions and structures of authority, we can reform them to make them better and to otherwise improve society. So there it is. There's our first working definition of the era of Enlightenment. Again, I will be repeating this several times throughout the lecture so that you continue to have a good feel of what is going on in Europe at this point in time in history. And, you know, one word that is not on this particular slide right here, but one word that you can think of is the word progress. Really, Europeans hadn't embraced any idea of progress prior to this period of time in European history. This idea that things can get better for future generations, that we can look at the structure of government, we can reform government, we could use science to make new discoveries, develop new technologies to improve our lives and society as a whole. So all of that is embedded in this definition of the Enlightenment. Okay, what starts the Enlightenment? There is no clear starting point for the Enlightenment. However, for our study of European history, and really this is my interpretation of European history that I'm imposing upon you, and I hope it makes sense. I say that the Enlightenment started with these two individuals, Isaac Newton and John Locke. Both of these individuals are English men, and they both published their major works within just a few years of each other. So Isaac Newton, let's talk about him first. Isaac Newton is the culmination of the scientific revolution when he publishes in the year 1687, which is 1 year before the Glorious Revolution, his magnum opus, the Principia. And the Principia explains how all things move throughout the universe. Now, very few people actually read the Principia outside of the world of science and math, but the central idea that's in the Principia does influence the way people start looking at the universe, which is this: the universe is governed by laws of nature. Everything is governed by laws. So when we ask some of the big questions of science, why is the grass green? Why is the sky blue? Why do we have seasons? There is a sense among most of the people in Europe in the 18th century, because of Isaac Newton, that these questions can be answered with science, that there is an underlying scientific principle that guides all of these things, or that can be discovered using mathematics and the scientific method. So people start embracing an idea that the universe is sort of like a big machine, and the machine is running based upon fixed laws. So this new way of thinking really is kickstarted by Isaac Newton's Principia, again published in 1687. And then the year after Newton publishes his big book, we have the Glorious Revolution. And then 2 years after that, John Locke publishes his big work, his magnum opus, two treatises on government. All right, so remember the context of this book. He publishes this book 1 year after the English Bill of Rights and the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. This is during the reign of William and Mary in England. This book pretty much serves as an explanation for how a democracy can work. And in his explanation, he pretty much turns people's traditional concepts of government on its head. He turns the whole system upside down, because previously you had a hierarchy that was based on a feudal system with a king on top, and the king divides up the land among his aristocrats, and then underneath the aristocrats are the majority of people who are commoners, and that was the setup. And the idea is the king protects and takes care of the aristocrats takes care of and protects the people, and then each strata of the hierarchy respects and obeys the lord, who is their superior. So commoners respect the aristocrats respect the king. That's the traditional structure of things. But then along came the English Civil War, and then a period of turmoil, and then eventually the Glorious Revolution of 1688. English Bill of Rights the following year, 1689. England has a constitutional monarchy, and then John Locke says, here's how we now need to think about things. Instead of a hierarchy, we think of human beings as being equal. Equal in that all individuals have natural rights. These rights are the right to life, the right to liberty, and, remembering this is John Locke we're talking about, the right to property. These are God-given rights to every single individual. And then John Locke flips the idea of government on its head. Instead of saying that everybody needs to respect a superior, he says, no, the job of government is to protect the rights of the people. And that creates a better, more stable society. So both John Locke and Isaac Newton present their books. One is a work of science, the other work is a work of political philosophy. They both are a rejection of the traditional way of looking at things. And up in England, these two books liberate people. People feel a sense of individual empowerment. People feel a sense of we can educate ourselves. We can continue to do scientific investigations and discover more things. We can develop new technologies. We can improve our lives. We can criticize traditional structures of power. For example, the legal system. For example, the educational system. Just because courts and schools have always run a particular way doesn't mean that we have to continue doing things in the same old way. We can think logically about these things and make improvements to improve these institutions and improve society as a whole. Now, those were just two examples that actually were criticized in the 18th century, and attempts were made to improve both of those institutions in England and throughout the continent. And I would say that people really wouldn't have been able to really start thinking like that had it not been for Isaac Newton and John Locke. Okay, so in the 18th century, we see people experiencing a greater sense of empowerment. So let me continue to give you some specific examples of what is happening in the Enlightenment in terms of how people, or rather how society is improving, arguably improving. And so these are good things to know if ever you need to provide a specific example in an essay for social improvement during the 18th century. So let me go through these. In medicine, the scientific method is improved to provide us with a better understanding of the human body and of diseases. And a great example of this is the development of the smallpox vaccine in the latter half of the 18th century. So smallpox was a killer. A great many people died of smallpox throughout the 18th century. And scientists came up with a very innovative way to inoculate people against smallpox, which was very dangerous and sort of a radical idea that in order to inoculate people, you give people a small dose of smallpox. You actually give them smallpox that'll boost their immune system so that they are, in fact, in the end, more resilient to smallpox. Now, to give you a little bit more vivid description of what the smallpox vaccine was like, it came around in the 1770s. And to get vaccinated, you would need to have somebody who was actually dying of smallpox. You would need to get the pus out of the skin of somebody dying of smallpox. And then the doctor would make an incision in your arm. So they literally cut open your arm, drawing blood, and they would take that pus and they put the pus on a knife and they would stick that pus under the skin of your arm. And then they'd bandage you up. So the pus was absorbed into your body. That was a smallpox vaccine. That was a smallpox vaccination. It was not necessarily a pleasant experience. It would be a lot easier today just to get a shot with a hypodermic needle. But they didn't have hypodermic needles back then. That's how they did it. We will learn about how Catherine the Great, or Catherine II, Tsarina of Russia, how she promotes smallpox vaccinations in Russia in the 1770s. And then, importantly to us in American history, George Washington mandated in the 1770s that the entire Continental Army receive a smallpox vaccination. So our army was vaccinated. The British Army was not. Therefore, fewer of our soldiers died of smallpox, and we go on to win the American Revolution. Some people argue that the reason why we won the American Revolution is because we were vaccinated from smallpox and the Brits were not. Okay, so there's one example of the Enlightenment and specifically how science is being used to improve the lives of the people. Okay, the second one, education. Prior to the 18th century, all education is controlled by religious institutions. If you are going to some class to be educated, this class is being conducted by a church. It might be a Protestant church, it might be a Catholic church, but education is being controlled by some religious institution. Now, this will be the case for most people well into the 19th century, that if you are educated in Europe, you are being educated by some sort of religious institution. The only exception to this is if you have a tutor, and certainly there were a lot of children whose parents would have hired a personal tutor for them, and that is how they would have been educated, as opposed to going to like a school of some sort. But even that tutor would have been providing an education that would have been interwoven with religion, whatever religion the family chose. Now, with education in the 18th century, there's not a movement to create secular schools. That doesn't really come around until the 19th century. But there is this idea that you can educate yourself. And so there's a movement to create books, and especially an encyclopedia. We'll learn about how Denis Diderot spent 20 years compiling articles and helping to edit the world's first encyclopedia set. The Enlightenment promoted self-education, that you shouldn't be dependent upon any source of authority, either the government or a church, to provide you with education, which would clearly be biased in favor of that government or that religious system, but that you could educate yourself. And by educating yourself, you could empower yourself. Now, the other two things I have in the slide here are money and military. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this. Money, inspired by the Dutch and the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. And then we also have up in Britain, the British East India Company. We've got a growing merchant class. We have more investors. We have more investment banking. And so what happened in the Netherlands in the 17th century starts to take off elsewhere, or at least continues to grow into the 18th century. And then military. We start to see enlightened reforms in the military. You'll remember Oliver Cromwell made a great deal of revolutionary changes to the English military with his new model army. That was, of course, the middle of the 17th century. In the 18th century, we'll see military reform, especially in the Prussian military during the time of Frederick the Great. Okay, so let's finally get to this guy, Voltaire. So before I get into depth with his biography, let me give you a very general overview of his life and why he is so important to the 18th century. Now, Voltaire was French, and everything I've talked about so far in terms of where the Enlightenment started was in England. So I talked about John Locke and Isaac Newton, and they were in England, and they started the ideas that created the Enlightenment. But so here's this French guy. So how does he fit into all this? Well, here's an easy way to understand Voltaire. Voltaire's French. He's from Paris. He goes up north and spends time in England, is inspired by Isaac Newton and John Locke, and then brings the ideas down into France, and he spreads these ideas throughout the continent. That's the easiest, simplest way to understand Voltaire and his significance. He brings the ideas of personal liberty and freedom, John Locke, and a scientific understanding of the universe, Isaac Newton. He brings them down from England into France, and they spread throughout the continent. Does Voltaire offer any new ideas during the period of time of the Enlightenment? No, not really. But he takes the core of the ideas of Newton and Locke, and he, Voltaire, inspires people throughout Europe with these ideas. All right. So the next question you should think is, well, okay, how does he do that? After all, Isaac Newton, how do you inspire people with Newton? Very few people read Principia. There aren't a whole lot of people out there who can do calculus and this scientific worldview where everything is run by laws of nature. The universe is just sort of a big machine. You know, how is that inspiring? How do you get people inspired by that? And John Locke, it's a little bit easier to understand how John Locke might be inspiring to people because, after all, a lot of people are oppressed and start thinking that you've got natural rights and the job of government is to protect your rights, not to bully you. Well, okay, that sounds like it's an exciting thing, but then how do you even publish those ideas without getting in trouble and getting locked up? So how does Voltaire do it? Well, in order to understand that, you have to know who Voltaire was. He was a writer. He wrote mostly plays and short novels called novellas. And what's important about his written work was that they were funny. His books and his plays made people laugh. And this is what makes Voltaire an interesting figure in European history, as well as an important and significant one. He was, by profession, a comedian. So not many people read Isaac Newton because who wants to read a big book of physics written in Latin? More people are willing to read a book of political philosophy by John Locke, but that work is banned throughout most of Europe. And if you did read John Locke, you just might get angry and want to start a revolution. But Voltaire's brilliance is not in coming up with original ideas, but taking those ideas of Newton and Locke and embedding them into stories, into plays that are funny, that make you laugh. And as you're laughing, they make you think. Arguably, Locke and Newton aren't that fun to read. But comedy is fun to read. It's more easily accessible, and it can be just as thought-provoking. So that, guys, is Voltaire in a nutshell. He goes up to England, he gets the ideas of Locke and Newton, brings them down into France, writes plays and short novels called novellas that are easy to read, that make you laugh, and these ideas spread throughout the continent. Voltaire is a comedian who becomes a household name. He is the most widely read author of the 18th century, which is in part why the great American historians, the husband and wife history team, Will and Ariel Durant, when they wrote their multi-volume history of the world, they titled their 800-page book on the history of the 18th century, The Age of Voltaire. So let's learn the biography of this man. He was born in the year 1694 in Paris, France, the bustling big city. Even as a young boy, he was a bit of a troublemaker. So his dad sent him out of Paris to go up to Belgium to a boys' school up there. In a nearby town, there was a Belgian girl that Voltaire fell in love with, and then was heartbroken when he had to come back home to Paris. And he had several heartbreaks like that as a teenage boy that sort of just continued to make him very cynical about life. And after getting his heart broken multiple times as a teenage boy, he would never marry as an adult man, but instead, once he became a celebrity, he just sort of had girlfriend after girlfriend after girlfriend. We'll talk about one of those girlfriends here a little bit later on in the lecture. But Voltaire, by the time he's a young man in his 20s, he's a smart aleck. And when you think about the French insult that was being cultivated in Versailles previously by Louis XIV, nobody was a better master of the French insult than Voltaire. And this was part of the culture of France, and especially Paris. Could you throw a zinger out at somebody that they couldn't respond to, and it would make everybody laugh at them, and everybody would admire you for your quick wit and your sharp brain. And when he's only in his 20s, this gets him into trouble. It was the early 1720s. The whole John Law and Mississippi bubble thing has happened. The French economy is in decline. Voltaire is strolling through some of the gardens in downtown Paris when he sees a man who's clearly a high-ranking aristocrat walking around talking about how in Versailles, the court has decided to sell half of the horses in the royal stables of Versailles to make some money. Voltaire turns and looks at this high-ranking aristocrat and says, well, why dismiss half the horses that fill the royal stables when it would be far more sensible to dismiss half the asses that fill the royal court? And this high-ranking aristocrat, who just happened to be the Duke of Orleans, yes, that same Duke of Orleans who was buddies with John Law, he turns to Voltaire and says, well, I can show you something you've never seen before. And the Duke of Orleans promptly has Voltaire arrested and sent to the Bastille prison. Okay, I need to take a moment here just to talk about the Bastille prison because it's important in the story of European history, and it especially becomes important during the French Revolution. So the Bastille prison is an old medieval fortress where prisoners are held, obviously, and it's mostly political prisoners. It's a fortress too, so it's guarded. Munitions like guns and gunpowder are sometimes stored there. And this, of course, makes it an important symbol of monarchical power. Now, the Bastille is no longer in Paris. It was torn down during the French Revolution in the late 18th century. You can compare it to the Tower in London, which was also a medieval fortress built in 1066, and the Tower is still there in London today. You can visit it and take a tour of the Tower. And similar to the Tower, political prisoners might be brought there, and they could be tortured, they could be executed there. This was not a happy place to be. Now, it was while Voltaire was in the Bastille prison that he actually gave himself the name Voltaire. So Voltaire was, even though I've been calling him Voltaire throughout this entire thing, Voltaire was not his birth name. The name given to him at birth was François-Marie Arouet, Arouet being his last name. Now, we don't really know why he came up with the name Voltaire that he was going to use for himself as a pen name. But it is speculated that he took the letters of his last name and mixed them around to create the name Voltaire. So his original last name is Arouet, and if you add Arouet, or if you add LJ to the end of Arouet, LJ standing for, in French, the younger, or le jeune, you take those letters, you mix them around, and the original Latin alphabet, U's and V's are the same. So you switch them around and you can create the name Voltaire. This may or may not be what happened with Voltaire in prison, but either way, he comes out of prison with a pen name. He is making himself his own individual, unique man. And then He gets mildly famous. He becomes mildly famous in the 1720s and in the 1730s by being a playwright. He takes stories that people already know, stories that, one of which is a tragedy and the other is a drama, and he satirizes them. He makes them hilarious. He turns them into works of comedy. So the first play that he wrote, or one of the first plays that he wrote that became very, very famous, was Sophocles' Oedipus, the King, the tragedy from ancient Greece. The story of a boy who was orphaned as a child, who grows up to become a king, but then, unbeknownst to him, kills a man that ends up being his father, and marries a woman that he didn't know was his mother. And when he discovers that he's killed his dad and is sleeping with his mom, he gouges out his eyeballs out of shame. And Voltaire takes this play and turns it into a comedy. The other story he turns into a comedy is the story of King Henry IV of France. Yeah, Henry of Navarre, that guy. Voltaire takes his biography and turns it into a comedy called La Henriade. And Voltaire gets his audience to laugh at things and to mock things that previously they were taught to look upon as a tragedy, or in the case of Henry IV, somebody to look upon in reverence. And Voltaire mocks these things. Famously, Voltaire's dad, the same guy who didn't think much of his son and was shipping him off to boarding school in Belgium when he was a teenager, he would go to as many of these plays as possible. And what a dad thing to do. He just stood he was up in the balcony in the cheap seats, just laughing and loving every minute of it, screaming from the balcony, "Oh, the rascal, the rascal," the rascal being Voltaire, his son, and these totally inappropriate but completely hilarious plays that he's written. These plays make Voltaire mildly famous. He's famous in Paris, but not really beyond Paris. But that's just enough fame to get him invited to Madame Gefferen's salon. Okay, so let me take a moment here to talk about what a salon was during the Enlightenment. So when we see the word salon today, we think of like a beauty salon. But that's not what you should think of as a salon during the time of the Enlightenment. During the time of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, in France, especially in Paris, the best way to think of a salon is it was a party for intellectuals. So France is not England, right? There's not as much freedom in France to speak your mind, to publish whatever it is that you want to publish. There's still a feudal structure in France. Doesn't matter about how you feel about natural rights. According to the political system of France, there are no rights beyond the privileges of your particular station in life. So in other words, in France, simply people aren't as free. But that doesn't mean that the French don't want to discuss intellectual ideas. In fact, just the opposite. France, and especially Paris, France, there's a great deal of intellectual, philosophical, and scientific curiosity. But it's France. There's the monarchy. The Bourbons are in charge. So you have to be careful what you say. So how the French responded to this was to have these parties. And that's what a salon was. So a salon was this event. It would usually be held in a home, and the home of a fairly prestigious person, an aristocrat. There weren't a lot of poor or uneducated people who were invited into these salons, and they certainly never hosted them. And so the best way to think of it is a party for intellectuals. So an aristocrat would host the salon, and there were usually invitations that went out. It was a formal affair, and it was by invitation only. Part of the reason why it was by invitation only is to make sure that no government spies got into the party to hear what was being said. So it was very much a formal affair. People would show up. There would usually be a very nice dinner. There may have been music and dancing, but of the few salons that I've read about, I don't remember reading anything about music and dancing, but it seems something that likely would have been there. They did do games at these salons. For example, they had a game called the Bean King. And the Bean King worked like this. Everybody got a piece of cake for dessert after dinner, and everybody bit into their piece of cake. And one of the pieces of cake contained a bean. And if you got the bean, then you got to be the king of the salon, and you got to make rules and make people do whatever it is that you wanted them to do. So, I mean, it was a fun party atmosphere. But it was also an intellectual atmosphere. And an intellectual atmosphere where there would be no police, there would be no government officials, there would be nobody there who would lock you up if you said something that was inappropriate. Inappropriate being something anti-establishment, if you wanted to say something bad about the Catholic Church or the royal family or something like that. So it was this free atmosphere in France. And it was in being so free, it was a very cathartic place. So you had all these intellectuals, all these really smart individuals who came from different backgrounds. Some might be interested in science and mathematics, others in exploration, others in literature. And they would all get together and they would talk. And they would be able to talk freely. Okay, so what made these parties for intellectuals, what made these salons so significant during the time of the Enlightenment? Well, first of all, this is going to be a place where ideas are going to be spread and ideas are going to be cultivated. In a day and age before any type of telecommunications beyond writing letters, people would travel to Paris, France to be a part of these salons. A great example of this, Adam Smith from Scotland in the middle of the 18th century traveled down to Paris to participate in these salons where he met a group of new innovative economists by the name of physiocrats who were trying to come up with new economic systems, better economic systems beyond mercantilism. And Adam Smith learned a lot from these individuals, and he developed the foundations of what would later be called capitalism from this. So the salons are a breeding ground for ideas, new progressive ideas, which sort of are the embodiment of the Enlightenment. The other significance of the salon in the 18th century is who could host the salons and who could be invited to the salons. So let's talk about who could host the salons first. Well, it's a party. Anybody could host it, including a woman. And that's the significance of Madame Jefferin's salon. Madame Jefferin was a madame. She was a woman. And in a day and age in which women had no rights and were effectively the property of their husbands, Madame Jefferin, with her salon, was able to establish herself as a very respected and revered woman in Paris. And here's how she did it. Madame Jefferin was extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily well-spoken. And true to French culture, she has a very quick wit. So she starts hosting these salons. And she would invite these salons to, or she would invite these intellectuals to her salon, and she would challenge them. She would ask them questions. Find out what they knew. She would ask them follow-up questions. She would interrogate everybody. And if she thought you were stupid and you couldn't keep up with her wit and intelligence, she would kick you out and you weren't invited back to the party. And so you would have some extraordinarily intelligent people, or people who thought they were intelligent, show up to Madame Jefferin's salon, and then Madame Jefferin would start interrogating these intellectuals. The room would hush. They'd look at this individual who's being interrogated by Madame Jefferin. And if she was able to outwit the individual and make them look stupid, well, then you knew that individual wasn't going to be invited back. And everybody respected Madame Jefferin because she was so intelligent. And so you can see what's going on here. First of all, this French culture of being able to speak with wit and with charm and intelligence, it was so highly prized in French culture. And of course, a lot of that goes back to the Versailles of Louis XIV. But then you have a culture that's intellectual, but it's also very democratic. It was a meritocracy. It didn't matter your gender. It didn't matter who you were. It was all a matter of how smart you were and how well spoken and how quick-witted you were. So there were many different salons throughout Paris. But throughout most of the 18th century, and I guess I can't give you very specific dates here, but of all the salons, Madame Jefferin's ended up being the most famous because it was the sort of the most difficult to survive in. And so only the smartest people were able to go there. So you could probably think of like the hot party to go to. And I don't know what you consider to be like, what's the greatest party to go to? I'd sort of shudder to think what makes a party great in teenagers' minds. But for the French intellectuals of the 18th century, it was Madame Jefferin's salon, because only the greatest minds were able to get in. And of course, it was by invitation only. The story of Madame Jefferin is also very important to know within the context of women's history. because women are so marginalized at this point in time in history. They are the property of men. And here is a woman who establishes herself as a revered figure in Parisian society in 18th century France. But the only way she could achieve this notoriety was by being extraordinarily intelligent, extraordinarily self-confident, developing her oratory skills, and having a sharp wit. And then also, she had to have money. She had to have the home to be able to host such a party. There were very few women anywhere in Europe who would have been able to do what Madame Geoffrin did, simply because of who they were and the position they were born into in society. Madame Geoffrin had to have been born into that level of society, and then all the other traits she really had to cultivate. But she did it. Okay, and the image that you see there on the right, if you can, it's a little bit grainy black and white image, but if you can see it, it's Madame Geoffrin talking to Voltaire. Let me actually show you another image here, which contains another important element of the salon. So as you look, this is actually still Madame Geoffrin's salon. If you look around, you see mostly men, but a few women too. And if you look near the middle of this image, you see an individual in a red coat sitting at a table with a black tablecloth draped around it. And the man is reading letters. He's got a stack of paper in his hands and he's reading them. This is another important element of the salon. These salon groups would get together, having read the works of authors from all over Europe, and they would write letters to these authors. So there was an exchange of ideas throughout Europe. So one way to think of the salons was like this. They were intellectual cells throughout Europe, and they exchanged letters with each other. So as one salon was discussing ideas, like in Madame Geoffrin's salon, they would be in communication with other intellectual communities, let's say in London or in Berlin or in Edinburgh, Scotland. Edinburgh, Scotland was actually another hub of the Enlightenment during the 18th century. There were two great Scottish philosophers, Adam Smith, the economist, and the philosopher David Hume. So you can think of these salons as these cells throughout Europe. And they created this sort of intellectual network. And they had a term for this intellectual network. They called themselves the Republic of Letters. The Republic of Letters. So that word republic connotates a democracy of sorts, and this idea that they're sort of their own nation, a nation without borders. And then by letters, they mean letters, but letters are how ideas are exchanged. So the Republic of Letters. Okay, so if you can look at this image here, you see a bunch of people who would have been famous at the time. These would be the intellectual elite that had survived Madame Geoffrin's interrogation, and it would have been a celebrated thing to have made it into this group. And if you take a look at the back, there's a bust of an individual, so a sculpture of an individual's head, a bust. That bust is a bust of Voltaire. Voltaire is not actually able to be in the room at the time because Voltaire was in prison. Voltaire spent a lot of time in prison because he just shot his mouth off way too much in public. And so he's remembered in this very famous painting of Madame Geoffrin's salon with a bust. And it was sort of a thing of honor for Voltaire. He was so daring and he was so bold that he went to prison. And here's an example of that. So the very first time that Voltaire got invited to Madame Geoffrin's salon, he was a show-off. He was loud, he was obnoxious, he'd walk up to anybody and talk their ear off. People would try to match wits with Voltaire, and Voltaire, he would make fun of them because he was probably the smartest guy in the room. And even though this is supposed to be a free atmosphere where everybody should be allowed to talk however it is they want to talk, there were a few people who started getting really annoyed with Voltaire, including this guy, an aristocrat by the name of Chevalier de Rohan. And de Rohan says to whoever he was talking to, "Who is the young man who talks so loud?" And Voltaire, who's on the other side of the room, overhears this, and Voltaire shouts at him, "My lord, it is one who does not carry a great name, but wins respect for the name he has." In other words, Voltaire says to this aristocrat, "I don't carry a noble name like you do. I earn my name. I win respect for my name based upon my own wit and intelligence." So de Rohan's response to this was, okay. Rohan has his servants wait for Voltaire after the party is over. Voltaire exits Madame Geoffrin's salon. The servants of de Rohan jump Voltaire and start beating him up. De Rohan tells his servants, "Don't hit him in the head. Something good may come of him yet." But they do make a pretty good mess of Voltaire. So, Voltaire, his honor has been besmirched. It was not uncommon in the 18th century, when your honor was at stake, to challenge your rival to a duel. So the two men agreed to a duel. Voltaire shows up first. When Rohan shows up, he shows up with his servants, of course. And instead of actually going through with the duel, Rohan just simply has Voltaire seized, and he uses his influence as an aristocrat to have Voltaire thrown once again into the Bastille prison. This time, after Voltaire gets out of the Bastille, he decides to run away. He goes to London for a little bit of time. Now, when Voltaire arrived in London, he did not speak any English. He had not been taught any English in school. French is the most important language in Europe, aside from Latin in the 18th century. But when he goes to London, he says, well, okay, I'm going to learn how to speak English. How long would it take you to learn a language going into the country cold and just trying to pick it up? Well, testimony to Voltaire's intelligence. He's able to not only learn English within 1 year, he is reading Shakespeare within 1 year and actually writing commentary about Shakespeare. And Voltaire, being Voltaire, begins making fun of the English language. He says, English is a completely illogical language. There is no consistency in English. And maybe you guys have thought of this, maybe you haven't, I don't know, but here's an example of what Voltaire had to go through and what he made fun of. He commented on how if the word tough is pronounced tough, then the word through shouldn't be pronounced through, it should be pronounced thruff to be consistent with tough. If you have the word lie that is pronounced lie, then the word believe should actually be pronounced believe. And then he ends up having a lot of fun with this one. If the word plague is pronounced plague, then the word ague, and if you're not familiar with the word ague means a sickness or a fever, then the word ague shouldn't be pronounced ague, it should be pronounced egg. So there are many examples of this in the English language, these inconsistencies. Voltaire quips in English, I wish that plague would take one half of this language and ague the other half. Now, if Voltaire couldn't stand the English language and thought it was far inferior to his superior French language, he still found inspiration in many things in English culture, in particular, religion. Voltaire had come from France, where the Edict of Fontainebleau was still in effect. Everybody was expected to be Catholic, no exceptions. In England, he finds a wide degree of religious tolerance. So he quipped, in England, there are 30 different religions and not one priest. One of my favorite quips of Voltaire from when he was in England involves what he had to say about the Quakers. Now, if you're not familiar with the Quakers come out of the tradition of the Anabaptists. They are pacifist. They do not believe in fighting. Also, if you ever go to a Quaker service, there's no altar. There's no place for a minister to stand to deliver a sermon. And that's because the Quakers are so egalitarian. They believe so much in equality that they do not believe that there should be one minister who stands up and looks down at you and delivers a sermon. So a Quaker service is silent. So Quakers all come in and then they sit down and they quietly pray. And then if somebody feels moved to speak, then that person stands up and just speaks. And then the person sits down again. And so a Quaker service is mostly silence, people sitting quietly and praying, and then occasionally a person pops up and says something and then sits back down again. That's a Quaker service. It's very different from most Christian services, and it's certainly very different from a Catholic Mass that Voltaire would be familiar with in France. And so he quips, the Quakers have astonished all of Christendom by actually acting like Christians. But aside from religion, there are two intellectual figures from England that have a great deal of influence on Voltaire, and I've already mentioned them at length. One is Isaac Newton. Voltaire reads the Principia, is greatly influenced by the Principia and the vision of the universe being governed by laws of nature. That will inspire Voltaire for the rest of his life. And then, of course, he's also interested and very inspired by John Locke. This is an image here of John Locke, and the front piece to his book the essay concerning human understanding, in which John Locke posits his idea that we're all born a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and who we are is simply a product of all of our experiences. Voltaire very influenced by that, and also by John Locke's concept of natural rights and the role of government. Now, let me just say right here, Voltaire is not a believer in democracy. He doesn't believe in it. He doesn't think it would ever work because Voltaire believes that most people are stupid. And that if you just gave everybody the right to vote, then they would elect somebody who's an idiot and it would be a disaster for whatever country. Voltaire believes that there are a handful of individuals who are intelligent, and it's really those people that should be running society. I think in Voltaire's mind, he would think something like, if only the super smart people that were able to pass muster in Madame Jefferson's salon could run our country, then we would have an incredible country. Okay, so that's Voltaire's attitude, but he's still very influenced by John Locke. And John Locke's epistemology, how we know the things that we know, his concept of human nature, and even though Voltaire never subscribed to the idea of democracy, he does like the idea of natural rights. All people have rights that are worth protecting. Okay, so after spending some time in England, he summarized his very positive feelings about the English people and the culture they've created in England, which is far more free than his culture in France. And so he wrote letters to his friends in London celebrating the culture in England. He wrote these while he was in London. He also wrote them in English, for what it's worth. And then he kindly asked the recipients of these letters not to publish them. He said, "This is from me to you. These are my ideas about what makes England a great country, far superior to France in terms of, well, certain things, your freedoms. And here's the incredibly positive influence that Newton and Locke have had upon your culture." And he expresses all these sentiments in these personal letters that he sent to his small group of friends, kindly asking them, please don't publish these, because if you publish these, then the French government might get a hold of them and they'll see what I wrote and I'm going to get in big trouble back in France. Okay. But this would be like, if you were the recipient of one of these letters, this would be like today if a very important author who's around today, like let's say J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, let's say she wrote you a series of essays and asked you, please don't publish these because it might get me in trouble. But you also know that if you publish them, you will make a bunch of money because they'll sell like hotcakes. Well, eventually, no surprise, Voltaire's letters got published first in England, then in France, which then lands Voltaire once again back into the Bastille prison. All right, but this time that he spent in England had a powerful effect on Voltaire in terms of his spiritual and religious beliefs. He pretty much gives up on Catholicism 100% when he's in England. And he embraces a new type of religious faith, if we can even call it a religious faith. Let's call it more of a philosophy. Voltaire embraced the philosophy of Deism. So Deism is an important term associated with the 18th century. Deism is a religious or theological belief. Actually, let me say that again. Deism is a philosophical or theological belief that was directly inspired by Isaac Newton's Principia. And here is what it is. So deism is a philosophy or a theology that states that God exists. God exists. And there is proof that God exists because of the beauty and the complexity of the world. You look at a sunrise, you look at a flower, you stare through a telescope and see the moons of Jupiter. You look through a microscope to see how there's microscopic life on a plant leaf. Life is so amazingly complex that this is proof of a divine creator. God exists. But God is not involved. God does not intervene with anything on earth or anywhere in the universe. God is in God's own place. God's in heaven. But God is not here. So in other words, deists do not believe in miracles. Deists do not believe It doesn't matter how hard you pray, God is not going to intervene with anything that happens here on earth. We are totally on our own. So the metaphor that was used for deism is to think of God as a great clockmaker. So let's say you see a grandfather clock, this big, beautiful, stately clock, and you can even open it up and you can see all the gears and mechanisms inside of it, turning the hands of the clock on the face of the clock. It's a beautiful machine, and you look at this thing and you say, well, clearly this thing didn't just appear out of nowhere. Somebody had to make the clock. There was a clock maker. This thing is too complicated to just all of a sudden be here. There was obviously a maker. But as we look at the clock and the gears are turning and the hands are moving and it's working, it's running, where is the clockmaker? The clockmaker is nowhere to be found. The clockmaker left a long time ago, but his beautiful clock remains. So this is the metaphor for deism. Obviously, the clockmaker is God, and the clock is the universe. So God essentially made things, wound it all up, and then let it go. And we are all part of this big, beautiful machine that's the clock. And so that's what the deists believe. It's a very scientific way of thinking about the world. So if you want to understand God, don't pray, learn science. Because that's God. God is in the laws of nature. God made all this. So figure it out. God's responsible for why the grass is green and why the sky is blue. So you want to figure out the nature of God, study science. And if life isn't treating you fairly, don't pray to God for help or for him to somehow intervene. You are on your own on this earth. You figure out a way to help yourself. That's deism. Deism, well, one way you can think of deism is it's the religion of the Enlightenment. God exists, he created everything, but if you want to figure out the nature of God, you study science and you figure out ways to improve your own life or society. But it's superstitious and childish to think that God actually somehow intervenes. And so many of the great intellectuals of the 18th century thought this is the new movement of religion. And of course, deism is also divorced from any single one religion. So who is God? Is God Allah? Is God Jesus? Is God the Protestant Jesus or the Catholic Jesus? No, God is God. And the deists hoped that all these other religions that had spent so much time fighting each other and killing each other, that they would let go of their little petty differences and embrace this more all-encompassing God that created the world and the laws of nature and then let it go. And if you're a deist, you're going to spend a little less time in church and a little bit more time educating yourself with science and mathematics, and otherwise developing a far more broad understanding of the world and the universe and how everything works. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how influential deism was in the 18th century, I've got an image of three men from the 18th century on here. The one on the left is Voltaire. The one in the middle is Thomas Jefferson. He was a deist. Many of our founding fathers came from particular religious backgrounds. Like Thomas Jefferson, he was a Virginian, so he came from the Anglican or Episcopalian tradition because he grew up in Virginia. But he embraced deism. And an example of Thomas Jefferson's deism was that he rewrote much of the New Testament of the Bible. And if you're interested in this book is called the Jefferson Bible. So Jefferson rewrote the New Testament of the Bible to eliminate all of the miracles of the story of Jesus. So you don't have Jesus performing any miracles in the Jefferson Bible. Instead, what you have are just Jesus's teachings on how to be a good person. And for Thomas Jefferson, and for many other people who read Jefferson's Bible, that's what was important about Jesus. Not that he could walk on water or turn water into wine, or he could heal the blind or the lepers or any of that stuff, but rather you are left with a Jesus who is giving the Sermon on the Mount, teaching you how to love your neighbor, teaching you how to love your enemy, teaching you how to be a good person. Another famous 18th century Enlightenment thinker and deist from our side of the Atlantic, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, who was also extraordinarily popular in France. And Ben Franklin grew up in Philadelphia, And Ben Franklin recounts in his autobiography how an older adult had given him an essay to read about how deism was evil. But Ben Franklin read the tenets of deism and said, I actually really this is exactly what I believe in. So deism is a direct outcome of Isaac Newton's Principia. It was an extraordinarily popular philosophy or belief system in the 18th century. It has since gone away. It's not to say that there aren't people who subscribe to deism today, because there are. There's still quite a few people out there who, once they hear about deism, they're like, oh, I really like this. I believe in this. But deism as a movement has disappeared. And that has largely to do with the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century and the 1890s was such an awful, cataclysmic event, it was thought that a lot of the ideas, like deism was one, that led up to the French Revolution, they must have been bad too. And so after the French Revolution, when we get into the early 19th century, the early 1800s, many people go back to more traditional religions. And deism really hasn't had the same popularity as it had in the 18th century. A lot of the individuals who were responsible for the American Revolution and for writing our Constitution as well were deists. And I would even argue there's quite a bit of deism in between the lines of our American Constitution, which is one of the reasons why there's such freedom of religion in the United States today. All right, back to Voltaire, back to France, and back to the French countryside. So Voltaire, after he gets out of the Bastille, yet again, how many times has he been in the Bastille now? I think 3. I'm losing count at this point. Well, after he gets out of the Bastille, he goes to live here. He can still visit this beautiful estate today. This particular house, this mansion, and this estate is near the town of Cirey in France. It's really close to Switzerland. That's good for Voltaire, because if ever the French government comes after him, he can hopefully hightail it across the border. And for pretty much the rest of his life from here on out, with the exception of a stay in the German-speaking states, which we'll talk about in a second, Voltaire is going to hover around the city of Geneva. And Geneva, you remember, is in Switzerland. That way, he's a little bit further away from Paris. He will still visit Paris frequently, but he's far enough away from Paris that if he starts to get in trouble with the French government, he can go into Switzerland where the French government can't get him. Now, the principal reason why Voltaire spends so much time here is because he's found a lady friend. The aristocratic owner of this estate, Émilie du Chatelet. Émilie du Chatelet may have been the smartest woman in Europe at the time, and she proved to be an intellectual match for Voltaire, which is probably why he fell for her. That and the fact that she was just an incredibly vivacious young woman. As a teenager, Émilie du Chatelet was very lucky. She had a dad who loved her very, very much. Now, if you were an aristocratic girl, you would receive a limited education, and this limited education was called a blue stocking education. Blue stocking. And so educated aristocratic girls were called blue stockings. Okay, so how were these blue stockings educated? Well, they were educated in such a way that they would seem attractive to male suitors, but not intelligent in an aggressive way. So, for example, aristocratic girls would be taught several foreign languages, and they would also be taught sentimental literature. So, for example, they would all read Romeo and Juliet. It was thought that girls should cultivate their language skills by speaking multiple different languages, and that females were naturally inclined toward literature, but not all literature, sentimental literature. Because this type of education of focusing on languages and developing more emotional empathy would make women better wives. This education was consistent with what was thought to be a woman's more delicate and subservient and kind and caring and nurturing nature. Émilie du Chatelet, of course, got that blue stocking education, but she was also really interested in math, philosophy, science, and pretty much everything. And her dad cared for her, and he allowed for her to learn these things. Again, this tends to be a pretty consistent story. These well-educated girls tended only to be well-educated if they had a dad who was willing to allow them to hire a tutor to teach them these things. Had Emily du Chatelet not had a dad who cared for her in such a way, then she would never have turned into the genius that she was. But as her own dad said, just with this blue stocking bias, my youngest, Emily du Chatelet, flaunts her mind and scares away her suitors, meaning that most men at this point in time in history do not want a woman who is smarter than they are. They don't care if the woman can quote poetry at length, they just don't want a woman who can do math better than them. It's just simply unattractive. This, however, will not bother Voltaire. Emily du Chatelet's dad was a court favorite at Versailles with Louis XIV. Emily du Chatelet, before she had her home in Syria, grew up in an apartment in Paris with 30 rooms and 17 different servants to take care of all of her wants and needs, so she doesn't have to make her own lunch while she's busy conducting science experiments. As was the tradition of the day, she was not able to select her own husband, but rather there was an arranged marriage. And when she was 19 years old, she had to marry a 34-year-old marquis, a French aristocrat, with whom she had several children. But for the most part, they allowed each other to have a great deal of freedom, which was also very common among the French aristocracy. So he did not live with her in Syria. He gave her the estate at Syria while he was off elsewhere, maybe Versailles, Paris, I don't know. But he would also have his mistresses on the side, and Emily du Chatelet was allowed to have whatever boyfriend she wanted at Syria. And so here comes Voltaire. The two of them met in 1733. She was 27 years old. He was 38. So the two of them never married, but they certainly spent a lot of time together. And really, Voltaire, even though he had many girlfriends throughout the course of his life, it seems to me that Emily du Chatelet, he clearly spent the most time with her. And not that I would actually know, but I think that he loved her. So he lived with her in Syria. He wrote plays to be performed because she had a little stage in her mansion. And so he would write plays and they would perform these plays, the two of them together, for their friends. Every morning when they woke up, they would take their coffee and have their breakfast. And then they would spend the very first half of the day, or rather the whole first half of the day, doing physics together and challenging each other with calculus problems. This is what I would encourage you teenage students to do on your dates. What could be more romantic than doing calculus together? Woohoo! This is what they did every day in the morning for the first half of the day. And they spent a lot of time reading Principia together. And Emily du Chatelet actually finds a part of Principia that she thinks can't be true. And she begins conducting her own science experiments. So she thought that Newton had made an error in Principia when he was writing about acceleration. And so I'll do my very best to explain this. It's not like you really have to know this, but here's what she did. She's talking to Voltaire and said, okay, if I hold a marble ball 1 meter above the ground and drop it, it's going to accelerate at a particular speed. And it's going to hit that ground with a particular force. Now, if I double the distance and I go up 2 meters and I drop that ball, Principia suggests that because I've gone up double the distance, then the force of impact on the ground is going to also double. And she says, I don't think that's right. She says, I think that ball will accelerate not by double, but rather the force will be squared. And so she conducts these experiments where she's literally dropping marbles into mud because the mud will give when the marble hits it. And sure enough, she comes up with proof that, if you're like, a meter above the ground and you drop the marble, and the marble goes into the mud and you get a certain distance that you can measure of how much the marble went into the mud. But then you double that, you go up 2 meters and you drop the marble. Then how far down into the mud it goes, that's not doubled, that's squared. So the ball is picking up energy as it accelerates. I'm not sure if that's mathematically precise, that sentence, but that's the best I can do. So here's what Emily du Chatelet does. She takes Newton's Principia, which is available throughout Europe in Latin, and she provides the very first French translation with her own commentary in it. And here is the original edition of Emily du Chatelet's Principia, or rather her translation of Principia. And so there it is, the French version of Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. And it might be hard to read under there, but it says written by the Marchese du Chastes. It's a slightly different spelling. Chastelet or something like that. But that's Emily du Chatelet. Here, at least according to the most recent Amazon search that I've done, here is the current edition in French of the Principia. And what's really interesting is, you look at it, it says Principia by Isaac Newton, and then underneath that it says Preface by Voltaire. And then underneath that, it says translation by the Marquis de Chatelet. Or I guess it's not Marquis, it's Marquise de Chatelet, the female version of Marquis. Okay, so Emily du Chatelet's discovery about acceleration and force would go on to influence Albert Einstein and his discovery of probably the most famous equation in the history of the world, E equals mc squared. So Emily du Chatelet was a very important woman in the history of science. So all those men I had to talk about during the scientific revolution, finally I can give you a major female figure. Emily du Chatelet, the love of Voltaire's life. But sadly, this love affair didn't last. Emily du Chatelet, while she was living with Voltaire and while she was in the process of translating Newton's Principia into French, she got pregnant. She was pregnant and she was over 40 years old. At this point in time in history, it is a very dangerous thing to be over 40 years old and pregnant. Not a lot of women survive childbirth at such an age at this point in time in history. Now it's commonplace and very safe for a woman in the United States to give birth in her 40s, but not back then. So Emily du Chatelet was very scared she wasn't going to survive childbirth and began working, staying up all night trying to get done translating Principia so that if she died, the French translation of Principia survives. But then she also tells Voltaire, by the way, this baby that I'm carrying, it's not yours. I've been sleeping with another man. And this reflects the more polyamorous culture of the French. This didn't actually upset Voltaire all that much, but Voltaire was worried about her health and whether or not she would survive childbirth. Sadly, Emily du Chatelet did not survive childbirth. But she did finish translating Principia, and that's why when that book was published, Voltaire wrote the preface, which was really a eulogy for the translator. And here's what Voltaire wrote. Emily du Chatelet, no woman was ever more learned than she was, yet no one deserved less than she did to be called a blue stocking. She only ever spoke about science to those from whom she thought she could learn. Never did she discuss it to attract attention to herself. She was not ever seen gathering around her those circles which wage battles of the mind, where one sets up a kind of tribunal and passes judgments on one century, which then in its turn judges you most severely. For a long time she moved in circles which did not know her worth, and she paid no attention to such ignorance. I saw her one day divide a 9-figured number by another 9-figured number in her head without any help in the presence of a mathematician unable to keep up with her. This preface to Newton's Principia is fantastic because we get this rich description of a female genius by the man who not only knew her best, but was also just smart enough that he could really appreciate how intelligent she was. Needless to say, there have been a couple of books written about this love affair. It does seem, to me at least, and my limited knowledge of this story, that Voltaire and Emily du Chatelet were truly soulmates. But then, after her death, Voltaire tended to his grief and dealt with his heartache by turning to writing. Voltaire wrote several short novels that are fairly quick and easy reads. After the death of Emily du Chatelet, they were very popular and they earned him a great deal of money as well as notoriety throughout Europe. And they were really thoughtful and provocative. They were all designed to really make Europeans put their own lives in perspective. For example, he wrote the story L'Ingénue, which was about Native Americans. Most Europeans looked upon Native Americans as curiosities and savages. But Voltaire puts Native Americans in a sympathetic light as people with their own cultures, with their own traditions, with their own civilization that might actually in some ways be better than the European civilization. Another story, micro-mega. Micro means small, mega means big. This is the small big, micro-mega. And it's the story of 10,000-foot giants who see a boat filled with human beings, and the giants scoop the boat up, and the giant has a conversation with the human beings on board. And the giants ask, well, what are you? And the humans say, we're human beings, we're people. Please don't kill us. And the giant said, well, I had no idea that such small people existed. And they continue to talk about their existence. And the giant says, that he lives for hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years. And he asks the human beings, how long do you live? And the people respond, well, I don't know, 70 to 80 years, usually at best. And the giant feels such sympathy for the human beings. Oh, you only live for such a short spell of time. Wow, I bet if you only live for such a short little period of time, you would just savor every moment and you wouldn't waste your time being mean to one another or fighting wars or anything like that. And the human beings say, oh no, we do a lot of that. We're really mean to each other and we fight a lot of wars. And the giant is so disgusted that he simply crushes the humans as thoughtlessly as you would squish an insect. Micro-mega is kind of interesting in that it's pretty much a science fiction story. And it should be clear that Voltaire is really trying to encourage his readers to put their lives in perspective. He also wrote Zadig, or On Destiny. Zadig is the story of a philosopher in ancient Babylonia who begins to discover how you have very little control over your life, that who you are might ultimately be nothing but a product of the forces that are around you, your country, your culture, your family, the traditions you're born into, the people that surround you. Is there any way to be your own independent person free of these things? Or does life simply push you in a particular direction, forcing you to do the things that you do, and that there really is no free will? These books are very popular, and they make Voltaire very popular throughout Europe. So he's not a traditional philosopher in that he doesn't come up with his own particular philosophical system like John Locke did, for example. But he writes these powerful stories that provoke thought, and there's usually this dark humor in the book, like at the end of Micro-mega, where the giants just crush the human beings as if they are nothing but small insects. Not long after Voltaire wrote Zadig, he received a letter. It was a letter that he couldn't believe. The letter was an invitation to come be the personal tutor of the King of Prussia. The King of Prussia lived in the city of Potsdam, which is just outside of the city of Berlin. You can visit Potsdam and this king's palace today still. It is called Sanssouci. Sanssouci is, of course, not a German name. It is a French name. So this goes to show just how influential French culture was in the 18th century when the King of Prussia, which is an important German state, builds a palace and gives it a French name. Sanssouci in French means without worries. The King of Prussia was a man named Frederick II. He is remembered in history as Frederick the Great. He had actually been communicating with Voltaire for over a decade, so the two had been pen pals. But then, in the precise middle of the 18th century, in the year 1750, Frederick II of Prussia asks Voltaire to come and live with him. Frederick wrote, Voltaire, you are the greatest man in France, an immortal who does honor to language. I count it one of the greatest honors of my life that I was to be born the contemporary of a man of such distinguished attainment as yours. It is not given to everyone to make the mind laugh. This is a king expressing respect and admiration to a comedian in the 18th century. Now, we will learn a whole lot more about Frederick in a future lecture, but I guess this is how you're getting introduced to him, through the lens of Voltaire, who traveled to the German state of Prussia, where he's going to learn the German language, just like once before he had learned the English language. Even though Frederick II is himself fluent in French and prefers French, and when the two men spend time together, they only speak French. But Voltaire still takes it upon himself to learn a little bit of German, and he makes fun of the German language as well, just like he made fun of the English language before. Voltaire quipped, "I wish that German had more wit and fewer consonants." But Voltaire feels incredibly lucky and incredibly welcomed. Voltaire is about 55 years old when he goes to Potsdam. He's been spending his whole life writing subversive comedy, spending time in and out of jail, and now here he is, this intellectual criminal, invited to be the personal tutor of a monarch. And so there's a lot of relief for Voltaire as he travels to Potsdam to live in Sans Souci. He proclaims, "I find a port after 50 years in the storm." And then he's happy to proclaim, "One thinks boldly, one is free here." So now we have Voltaire tutoring the king, Frederick II of Prussia. And we've mentioned situations like this before. You can think of Queen Christina of Sweden hiring Descartes to be her personal tutor. But this was a much more intimate thing. Frederick was already a very educated, grown man, and he's already king. He's been king for 10 years when Voltaire shows up on the scene. So Frederick is no young kid. He's an adult man. What he's seeking from Voltaire isn't just education, but counsel. Voltaire is an advisor. So we have a term that's appropriate to introduce here. We have in the 18th century the emergence of a new, well, relatively new type of government. And the term is Enlightened monarchy. Enlightened monarchy. Okay, so let's contextualize Enlightened monarchy in the 18th century and what has happened up until the 18th century in European history. So when the class starts off in 1750, the Pope has an incredible amount of power and all the monarchs in Europe are Catholic. Then we have a Reformation. This decreases the power of the Pope and increases the power of monarchs. And then after the period of religious wars, we start to have civil wars, specifically in France and in England. England ends up with a constitutional monarchy. France ends up with a very powerful absolute monarch, Louis XIV, who is the envy of every other king in Europe. All the monarchs want to be like Louis XIV. But then we go into the 18th century, and the ideas of the Enlightenment come around. The Enlightenment was an era where people believed you could use logic and reason and mathematics and science to discover new things, as well as to question traditional institutions of power and other traditional practices, and make constant improvements to improve society. So this leads us to enlightened monarchy. And the idea of enlightened monarchy is this: the best possible country is a country with a monarch, a country with a king. But the king shouldn't be an abusive king like, let's say, Charles I in England was, but rather the king or the queen, I guess I could say, the monarch should be enlightened. This means the monarch thinks rationally. The monarch is critical of traditional customs and institutions of power. And the monarch, who is reasonable and who is well educated, makes decisions to improve the lives of his or her people. And that, for those who believe in enlightened monarchy, is the best form of government. Republics, or like a constitutional monarchy like what England has, or republics like what the United States and France are going to create at the end of the 18th century, those are too messy. Parliaments and Congress, they don't work very fast. They're divisive, and there's just a lot of people yelling at each other in a democracy. People like Voltaire and Frederick the Great, who believe in this idea of enlightened monarchies, say this is the best form of government. You have one individual in charge, and the individual is a smart, caring, enlightened individual who can just say, hey, here's how we're doing things, and we're doing these things because I'm the monarch and I say so, and we're doing these things because they are reasonable and because they are the best thing for the people. So an enlightened monarchy is a benevolent monarchy, it's a kind monarchy, but the word enlightened means educated. It means rational. It means progressive. And so the story of Frederick II is an excellent example of enlightened monarchy. He hired Voltaire to come be his tutor and his advisor. If ever you have to write about an enlightened monarch, Frederick II of Prussia is always an excellent example. So Voltaire and Frederick II spending so much time together, talking in French, reading French books, the King of Prussia deferring to a comedian to take in ideas for how to best rule his country. This was truly a very unique situation. Frederick II, as you'll learn later, was a very unique monarch. Okay, there's an important work that comes out of this relationship. Frederick the Great wrote a book with the help of Voltaire. Now, it is worth noting that Frederick the Great wrote this book before he became, or it was right at the time when he became king in 1740. That's 10 years before Voltaire showed up to live with him at Sanssouci in Potsdam. So in 1740, when Frederick was still a prince, but he knew his dad's dying and that he's going to become king soon, he wanted to articulate in writing what type of king he was going to be. And it was about at this time when he was starting his correspondence with Voltaire. And so Frederick II, or Prince Frederick, I guess at the time, he would send Voltaire his manuscript for his book for here's how I want to rule and here's the best type of leadership for a king. And Voltaire would give his commentary and then send it back to Frederick, who was then still living in Berlin. Okay, so here's the book. It was written in French. The title of the book is The Anti-Machiavel. The Anti-Machiavel. It was published in 1740, which is the same year that Frederick II becomes King of Prussia. If you look at the French cover page there, there's the subtitle, The Anti-Machiavel, or Critical Essays on the Prince of Machiavelli, published with Mr. Voltaire. So this is considered to be one of the most important works of enlightened monarchy. You hopefully remember really well Machiavelli's work, The Prince. Machiavelli had written The Prince for Cosimo de' Medici II, or I'm sorry, that's not right, Lorenzo de' Medici II, and it's an instruction manual for how to acquire and maintain power. So you remember the big quotes, the ends justify the means. You can do whatever you need to do in order to achieve power. A prince must be able to act like a fox in some situations and a lion in another situation. And the last big thing that I want you to know from Machiavelli's The Prince is how Machiavelli explains that a prince should try to be both feared and loved. But if he cannot be both, he should be feared. Because people are more motivated to avoid punishment than they are to be nice to somebody out of some sense of indebtedness because they had been treated nicely before. So Frederick II, just like probably every leader in Europe, had read Machiavelli, and Frederick II disagrees. The Anti-Machiavel is a book about leadership, and Frederick II makes the moral argument that the greatest leaders are those leaders that treat their people kindly, who do good for their people. And so he wrote in the Anti-Machiavel, to gain affection of the people and the great, it is necessary for a prince to be humane and gracious and to have a fund of probity and virtue and to inspire confidence through wisdom. Voltaire's 4-year stay at Sanssouci with Frederick the Great ended with Voltaire running away. I can't really explain Voltaire's behavior here, guys, other than I think Voltaire just liked being the bad guy. But here's what went down. In the middle of the 1750s, war is looming once again in Central Europe. We'll talk about this in a future lecture. And Prussia is getting ready to expand its borders. It's getting ready to go and likely take over Saxon lands. You guys remember Saxony from our era on the Reformation. Anyway, before this happened, there was some real estate speculation. So there were some Prussians who were in the know that likely this was going to happen. And so they were buying lands in Saxony because they knew once Prussia took it over that this land would be worth a lot more money. So there was real estate speculation. And Frederick didn't like this, so he put an end to it, and he said it's illegal if you are Prussian to buy lands in Saxony. But guess who did buy lands in Saxony? Voltaire. Now, why would Voltaire do that if it was illegal? I don't know. Did he think he was beyond the law because he wasn't really Prussian? He's French. I don't know. It was just a weird thing to do. Voltaire had also been critical of Frederick and how he started the last war by taking over lands called Silesia, which belonged to the Austrian Habsburgs. They were part of Austria, and essentially Frederick stole these lands. And so it might have been that before Frederick started another war in another way to seize more land, Voltaire just left. He got out of there. And so Voltaire fled. Now, also, coincidentally, it's right when Voltaire leaves that an anonymous book begins circulating around Europe. And this book is called The Private Life of the King of Prussia, which talks about the homosexual interests of the King of Prussia, which is, of course, Frederick II. Nobody knows who wrote this book, but it seems very Voltaire-like. Now, by the time that Frederick II finds out about the book, Voltaire has made it all the way into the western part of the Holy Roman Empire. He's in the city of Frankfurt. It's there that the Prussian troops nab him and they throw him into jail. And from jail, Voltaire and Frederick continue to correspond with each other. And whether Voltaire was guilty or not of writing this salacious book, Frederick II, out of admiration for Voltaire, allows him to go free from prison. Where does Voltaire go from here? It's kind of interesting. At this point in time in his life, he thinks about going to the American colonies, and specifically the city of Philadelphia. Oh, wow, what history would have been like if Voltaire had gone to Philadelphia at the end of the 1750s. He would have known Benjamin Franklin, and Voltaire would have been a significant part of our history. But he doesn't go to Philadelphia. He'll spend the rest of his days in and around Geneva, Switzerland. He actually lives in Geneva, Switzerland for like in downtown Geneva for a period of time at the end of the 1750s, where he begins the process of writing history books, one history book after another. Now, these history books aren't too popular today in terms of everything that Voltaire wrote, but they are interesting in terms of how he wrote history. His history was a little bit of a cynical history, but it was all the history books in the 18th century, it was very objective. Because most history books that would have been written at this point in time in history or before would have been written and published by a government or a religious institution. So the history books tended to be very biased. So if you were in England, for example, and you read a book on English history, it would be very biased in favor of the English. The point of the book would be to make you patriotic. Well, Voltaire doesn't do patriotism. Voltaire doesn't do reverence. So Voltaire's histories are far more objective, scientific, and fact-based. Okay, so like I said, Voltaire's history books, they're not that well known today, but he did inspire one of the greatest historians of all time, who is the Englishman Edward Gibbon. Gibbon is famous for writing the famous 6-volume set, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This, like I said, it's 6 volumes long. It's a huge series that details, well, what the title says, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. This is a work of magnificent scholarship. And Gibbon's aim was, of course, to figure out how does a major empire fall? So he tries to answer this question, why did the Roman Empire go down? Gibbon was inspired by a lot of people to approach history this way, to write this objective history that provides this very important lesson. It's the result of detailed scholarship, a lot of research. Gibbon was inspired by a lot of people, but Voltaire was one of those people with his histories. Voltaire moved outside of Geneva proper to the border town in Switzerland called Ferney, and it was here in this big, beautiful house that Voltaire spends the remainder of his life. And as Voltaire gets old and his days wind down, his satire becomes even more biting, and in his personal life, he engages in some very mellow and relaxing activities. Hey, but first of all, I've got a little image here on the screen. So you can see Switzerland as it relates to France, how it's situated next to France. You can find Geneva and you can find Ferney, and you can see how Geneva is located on Lake Geneva. And Geneva is, of course, a very important city to know throughout European history. The Calvinists took it over in the 16th century. It's where John Calvin lived, and he reformed this city. Now, the strict theocracy of Calvin's day goes away, but what's left with Geneva is a city where many radicals will come to live and be protected and free. And we'll learn about several radical authors who will spend time living and writing in Geneva. Voltaire is one. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we'll learn about later, he's another one. And then in the early 19th century, the English writers Lord Byron and Mary Shelley They will spend time living and writing in Geneva. Mary Shelley is the author of Frankenstein, which she was inspired to write while living in Geneva. At the end of his life, Voltaire became even more biting with his satire. He really wrote a great deal about the ridiculousness of religious practices and religious beliefs. In his personal letters to friends, he would write, "Écrasez l'infâme," which means crush the horrible thing. The horrible thing meaning the Roman Catholic Church. He urged his friends to rise up against it. Then, in 1759, when Voltaire was in his early 60s, he wrote a rather short book. It's less than 100 pages long. Most people consider it to be his masterpiece. He wrote it while he was living in Ferney. At this point in time in his life, he was spending a great deal of time gardening. He really enjoyed gardening. It was an activity that helped him relax, and it just brought him a great deal of joy. Throughout his whole life long, Voltaire had said, "I'm never happy unless I'm working." But in his 60s, he finds an activity that really just brings him a lot of joy. So Voltaire, on his huge estate, personally planted 4,000 trees. And some people believe that the fact that Voltaire was spending so much time gardening, that actually gives us some insight into this masterpiece that he wrote. Okay, Voltaire wrote his masterpiece in response to two things that Europeans were talking about in the middle of the 18th century. One was a quote by the great Prussian mathematician Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz is the co-discoverer of calculus along with Isaac Newton. And in fact, if you study calculus at Upper Arlington High School, you're studying calculus using the notation that Leibniz created, not Newton. And in an essay that Leibniz wrote, he said that this world that we live in is the best of all possible worlds. In other words, things have worked out in a particular way that this world in which we are living in cannot possibly be any better than the way it is. So Leibniz's statement is a very happy, positive, upbeat statement about the world in which we live. And for a satirist like Voltaire, he couldn't stand it. But it was something that people were talking about in the salons. If God created this world, then this world is the creation of God. Therefore, it can't be any better than the way it is. And if there are bad things that are in this world, it's because human beings have screwed things up. It's because of our freedom, which God gave us. So this is the best of all possible worlds. So that's the first thing that inspired Voltaire to write his masterpiece. The second was this. There was a horrible earthquake that shook the town of Lisbon, Portugal, killing thousands, and it happened on November the 1st, 1755. Now, November the 1st is, if you're Catholic, All Saints' Day. Now, if you're Catholic, a saint is anybody who is in heaven, and this is a day that you honor and respect them. Some of you may be familiar with the Mexican holiday, the Day of the Dead. It's the same thing. Day of the Dead is just the Mexican adaptation. The Mexican adaptation of All Saints' Day. So on All Saints' Day in the morning, go figure, there are a lot of people who are in church. And when that earthquake hit, it killed a lot of people who were in church. The church walls crumbled and crushed the people who were inside, praying for the lives of the saints. Now, Lisbon is a port city on the Atlantic Ocean, which means it gets a lot of ship traffic coming in, and there are a lot of sailors who've been at sea for a long, long time who get off to relax in Lisbon. And so Lisbon is a city that caters to the needs of the sailors, and many times what sailors want when they come into port are alcohol and women. So in Lisbon, there were a lot of bars and there were a lot of brothels. And guess what didn't collapse during the Lisbon earthquake? Most of the bars and the brothels. So now this posed an interesting theological problem for people who believe that God is actively involved in monitoring the affairs of the earth. It's one thing for people to say, okay, God allows all people to be free, and so if there's a war, you could say, well, humanity caused that. War is terrible, war is awful, but it was still human beings that caused it. An earthquake is what some people would refer to as an act of God. And people were confounded. Why would God kill people in churches, but save the whores and the whoremongers and people who are drinking alcohol at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning? Why would God spare those people? So this Lisbon earthquake, this too, caused a bunch of philosophical chatter in the salons. So inspired by Leibniz's quote, "This is the best of all possible worlds," and also inspired by the Lisbon earthquake and listening to people who are not deists trying to explain God's actions, Voltaire wrote his masterpiece, Candide. Candide, or On Optimism. Voltaire sat down and he wrote this book in 3 days. After he wrote it, he sent the manuscript out to friends, asking them to sit down and read it in 1 day. It's about 100 pages. This probably would not have been a problem to too many people in the 18th century, since they didn't have any of our 21st century distractions. Sitting down and reading 100 pages would be no big deal to them. And then he hosted a salon where everybody could get together, eat good food, drink good wine, and talk about the book. So what is this book about? Well, Candide is a boy, a young man, a teenager, and he is naive and optimistic to the core, believes pretty much anything anybody will tell him. Candide, young, optimistic, naive, believes everything's good in the world. He also is very attracted to an aristocratic girl named Cunegonde. And Candide believes that he will be perfectly happy once he can be with and marry the lovely Cunegonde. A beautiful girl will just make everything okay. He also has a tutor. His tutor's name is Professor Pangloss. Professor Pangloss has an absurdly long and silly title, which seems to suggest that he knows everything, but in fact he knows very little. But Professor Pangloss convinces Candide, the young naive teenage boy, that this world is the best of all possible worlds. And Candide believes it. But bad things are going to happen to Candide. He's caught making out with Cunegonde, the beautiful, lovely Cunegonde, and he's kicked out of his home and he's kicked out of his kingdom. And most of the book of Candide is him traveling all around the world, meeting different people, having different experiences, but always desperately trying to get back to his beautiful, lovely Cunegonde, who, by the way, aside from the brief makeout session, wants nothing to do with Candide because Candide is not a wealthy, powerful man. Cunegonde is sort of a very sort of beautiful but superficial girl. She only wants a man who's wealthy and powerful and who can take care of her. So Candide travels all over the world, even making it to the famed city of El Dorado, tucked in the Amazon forests of South America. People walk on streets that are pebbles of gold. Everybody's happy. Nobody fights. Everybody has everything they want. Does Candide stay there? No. Why not? Because Cunegonde isn't there. So he leaves and he ventures on, and wherever he goes, tragedy befalls him. People die. People are horribly wounded. Candide himself gets beaten and tortured and left for dead. He goes to Lisbon and hears the details of the horrible earthquake. In the Americas, he saw slaves being harassed. There's war, killings, drownings, all of these awful things. And the whole time Candide says, well, this is the best of all possible worlds. For most readers, Candide is humorous in a very dark way. Voltaire, through the tragedy and the humor, is giving us insights into human psychology, the way we think, how we justify our experiences and our behaviors. But in the end, Candide finds Cunegonde. He also finds his old tutor Pangloss, and they all live together. Now, Cunegonde, at the end of the story, she'd gone through her own trials and tribulations, and she's no longer a beauty. In fact, she's pretty ugly. And it's only because she's ugly that she decides to marry Candide, because he's the only man who will take her. Candide takes her and marries her, not because he's currently attracted to her, but he's gone through so much to get her that he finally just sort of shrugs and says, okay, here's the love of my life. But Candide and Cunegonde are together. Happy ending, right? And Pangloss walks up to Candide at the very end of the story and says, see, I told you, this is the best of all possible worlds. To which Candide responds, yes, that's all very well and good, but let us cultivate our garden. And that's the final line of Candide. Let us cultivate our garden. One of the great lines of the entire Enlightenment. Now, there's multiple ways to interpret this sentence, but here's one. The 18th century is the century of big ideas, philosophies, progress, science, mathematics. And there were people in the 18th century, just like there are people today in the 21st century, who are dedicated to a particular belief system, a religion, a political philosophy, some sort of systematic philosophy that lets us know here's what's right and here's what's wrong, and it's absolute. Candide was motivated by his own philosophy, which was this is the best of all possible worlds. But in the end, beaten down and exhausted and with a wife that he doesn't even really love anymore, he simply renounces, let us cultivate our garden. In other words, let's take care of the things that are right here in front of us. Let's do our jobs. Take care of our families. Be nice to our friends and to other people in our community. Let's work on growing what we have right here in front of us. Let's each of us do our part. Let us cultivate our garden. All right. Candide and pretty much everything Voltaire wrote was a form of satire. Satire is still very much around today. I tend to think of late night talk show hosts and Saturday Night Live as an excellent example of modern contemporary satire. And satire today is the same as satire in the 18th century when Voltaire was doing it. In satire, you mock the things that you're supposed to take seriously. Governments, religions, anybody who's in authority over you. You make fun of them. Now, why do you make fun of them? Well, in part because it feels good. It's cathartic. And then also, if those people or institutions of power are behaving poorly, they deserve to be made fun of. It's good for us, and ultimately, it might be good for them. Comedy, as we see in European history, is a democratic force. We saw this first with Erasmus. He satirized the church. He mocked the church. He made fun of Pope Julius II. It doesn't matter what the hierarchy of authority is, comedy can level anybody. This continues on with Voltaire, a comedian who became the most famous writer in Europe in the middle of the 18th century. There was no greater celebrity than Voltaire. He became a tutor to a king. He influenced historiography, and in the end, he writes one of the greatest works, that's also one of the shortest works in European history, but one of the greatest works of the 18th century, Candide. Voltaire was dying about 20 years after he wrote Candide. In the late 1770s, he went up to Paris. He wanted to go see a play. He got sick in the carriage ride back home. He probably died of pneumonia. He pronounced to friends at his bedside, I die adoring God, loving my friends, not hating my enemies, and detesting superstition. 10 years after Voltaire died, France exploded in revolution. Some people felt that Voltaire contributed to that revolution. 1 year into the revolution, the Pantheon was built in Paris, a place to memorialize the greatest Frenchman in history. The Pantheon is a tomb for those great individuals. And one of the first individuals to have his remains transported and buried in the Pantheon was, of course, Voltaire. And thus ends my telling of the story of Voltaire.